Good morning, Beth. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fabulous, and I'm so happy that you could join us today on this episode of Rare Awareness Radio. We are welcoming in our new friend, Dr. Beth Potter from up in Ottawa. And this is part of our continuing series on the Canadian PKU Association, CANPKU Plus. And I'm excited today because we're going to get into registry conversations and research conversations. And so far in this series, we've had the benefit of speaking to some patients, to some clinicians, to some advocates in the funding space, but not a lot about research. So I'm excited to talk about research with you, Beth. So just thank you for joining us, Beth.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. This is some great initiatives.
I would love for you to kind of take just a few moments to introduce yourself to us, Beth. I certainly could introduce you, but I'm not going to do as good a job. So would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and saying hello?
No problem. So my name is Beth Potter. I am a professor in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Ottawa. I'm a researcher, so I'm not a clinician. I'm more of a kind of methodologist with a longstanding interest in research that I hope will ultimately improve healthcare and outcomes for people, particularly children with rare diseases.
I love that. And you are part of what we call Inform Rare, or I guess you're leading Inform Rare, which is the Canadian PKU registry. I know we're going to get into more of that later, Beth. But maybe start a little bit. You and I both have a public health background. I'm more on the leadership and management side. You're much more on the research and epidemiology side. But let's talk about what first drew you into rare disease research and particularly metabolic conditions. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, sorry. And also, just to say that I know we'll talk about the Canadian PKU registry later, but it's really a partnership between CANPKU Plus, with the patient organization, and the Informer Research Network.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, so my background, so I completed a PhD in epidemiology and came to Ottawa to do a postdoctoral fellowship here where I was really interested in newborn screening. And so, newborn screening programs, which are basically population wide programs where almost every newborn, or every newborn in the population, is offered a screening test to identify rare conditions that might not be apparent at birth, but where it's really important to identify them at an early stage and intervene in order to have much improved outcomes. And PKU, so phenylketonuria, PKU is really kind of the hallmark of newborn screening. It's really the reason why we have newborn screening programs. We've had newborn screening for PKU since the 1960s here in Canada. And I know in the US as well. And so I was really interested in newborn screening. And this was a long time ago. So this is about 20 years ago. And screening programs were expanding quite rapidly at the time. And I was interested in policy decision making about that. Like, how are people making decisions about whether or not to add a condition to the existing newborn screening panels? And so I was looking at evidence, I was looking at the decision making. And what we ended up finding in our research was that really the lack of strong evidence around the effectiveness of some of the treatments for the rare conditions that were being proposed to be added to screening were likely responsible for kind of the difficulties in making decisions about whether we should be screening for conditions or not. And so that led me into really the rest of my career so far, which has been about trying to find ways to improve the evidence base, not just for newborn screening, but also just for delivering better healthcare and improving outcomes.
And Beth, do you still exclusively, or I shouldn't say still, but do you only focus on metabolic conditions as part of what your research, or are you looking at other things as well? I'm curious.
I do look at some other conditions as well. So the reason why my initial interest was in metabolic conditions, I guess, was twofold. One is that um, this is still true, but was particularly true back when I was doing research on newborn screening, that the vast majority of conditions that are targets of population-wide newborn screening programs are rare inherited metabolic conditions.
Mm.
Many of these conditions also have treatments that are dietary in nature. I had a background in nutrition, so I was also kind of interested in sort of the metabolic conditions from that standpoint. But the Inform Rare Research Network has really focused on research in kind of three rare diseases that are all really quite different from each other. Two are inherited metabolic diseases, so phenylketonuria, PKU, mucopolysaccharidosis, so MPS, and then one that is not a metabolic condition, it's a neuromuscular disorder, spinal muscular atrophy.
Mm.
So our kind of research network has is interested broadly in rare disease research and then kind of applying within those sort of three exemplar conditions.
Thank you for all of that. And it is pretty interesting to me as well that you mentioned it's been decades, right? Since the 1960s. So 60 years, really, for those of us that were born in the 60s and 70s, that decades of newborn screening programs have been in use, right? Or were introduced and now are in use. But it's still, these conditions are still so important for researchers to study, aren't they, Beth?
Yeah, it's true. I think that, PKU is such an interesting condition from that standpoint because I think there could be a temptation if you don't know a lot about PKU to think, wow, we've kind of solved it, haven't we? Like we're identifying nearly every newborn in the population with PKU, and we know that that early initiation of medical nutrition therapy for PKU has a huge impact on outcomes and really prevents kind of the worst neurocognitive effects of PKU. But I think one of the sort of interesting things about rare diseases is that there's just so much heterogeneity within a rare disease, and there's so much that we don't know. And I think that what we've realized with PKU is that there still are often kind of suboptimal outcomes in the kind of population of people who have PKU. And some of that may be because the medical nutrition therapy is really arduous. It's extremely difficult, and it's very difficult even for families who have lots of resources. But not everyone does have lots of resources, and then it's even more challenging. And so there's the kind of adherence to the medical nutrition therapy, which is really difficult. But there's still a lot of unanswered questions about some of the kind of longer term neuropsychological outcomes with PKU, and even research now on what some of the kind of long term effects might be of having such a synthetic diet. So that's not really my expertise, but I think there's just a lot of questions, almost surprisingly so, for a condition that we kind of think that we know a lot about.
That again, I think that's so important because again, as you and I kind of talked a little bit about, this has been helping me to better understand and have a much deeper appreciation for PKU, the condition, the treatments, and you can almost minimize it too. Well, if you just follow the right diet, then it's not a big deal, and everything that you just hallmarked on around. Well, yeah, it still is a big deal because one, resources available to maintain that diet, and then like you say, thinking about the longer term effects of that diet, right? Certainly, our appreciation in some of the moms and dads and patients we've talked to, it's a lot, right? And thinking about where that will be another 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when you've been on this diet for such a long period of time, right? So it's so important, Beth. Thank you, thank you. Um, you mentioned Inform Rare a minute ago, and I know a big part of your work is thinking about the Canadian PKU registry. But let's back up for a second, just for folks to understand what is a rare disease registry, Beth.
Sure. So I think of a rare disease registry as essentially a database
Mhm.
that includes information about important outcomes longitudinally for people who have a particular rare condition in order to kind of better understand that condition, facilitate other research, including clinical trials. I guess what distinguishes it from clinical trials is that it's an observational kind of research method. So we're not intervening, but we're trying to collect information over a long-term period to better understand condition.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And in terms of how it intersects with sort of advancing research and treatment, I guess one would surmise that data is so important because it is what you continue to kind of mine, look for those outcomes, and try to understand how those can be applied to advancing research. Is that right, Beth?
That's right. So it can help us to understand natural history. So how a disease, people with a condition kind of progress over time on important outcomes. And also how people do on with different treatments, which is becoming really important, I think, in rare disease. As new treatments are emerging all the time, we need to kind of understand what are their kind of long-term impacts on patients, including relative to and in combination with other treatments that exist out there. So to kind of look at sort of the real world evidence around treatments over time in the patient population.
And specifically, Beth, when you think about the Canadian PKU registry and its goals, maybe are they the same, different? I assume every disease registry has its own goals. Some of them may be sort of, common, but specifically for the Canadian PKU registry, what are the main goals for you folks?
So I think some of the main goals would be to better understand patient and caregivers' priorities and experiences,
Mhm.
specifically in Canada. I know CANPKU Plus for a long time has recognized potential value of having Canadian specific data for PKU. To kind of document, as I was sort of talking about with registries in general, to document the longitudinal trajectories of PKU. So the natural history, including how people do on different treatments. Also to facilitate the design and conduct of clinical trials. And that's something that I've been really interested in is how patient registries in rare disease can kind of intersect and complement clinical trials. So for example, registries can be used to understand, to help design a trial, like to know what outcomes you might want to focus on in a trial, and what the kind of variation is in the patient population with respect to those outcomes. We can also use registries to see how many people might be eligible for a clinical trial and maybe even to invite them to a trial. And then also to follow people up after a trial ends and see how they're doing kind of over the longer term. So I think this sort of facilitating clinical trials and complementing clinical trials has been a goal of the registry as well. And then also providing people with access to their own data and with access to kind of group level information as we accumulate data in the registry, so that patients and caregivers have a better understanding too of how the
Right.
Canadian PKU community is doing.
Right, as a whole, right? That's
Yeah.
yeah. When we spoke with our other new friend, Maureen Smith, a couple of days back, she talked a lot about patient-partnered research, right? And I know Inform Rare has emphasized patient partner research, Beth. From your perspective as a researcher, why is it so important for the patients and the families to be directly involved in both the design of research, but also the design of these registries too?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you spoke to Maureen because I've learned so much from Maureen about patient partnership in research and have been working with her for a long time. I'm really fortunate that she leads the patient engagement and partnership strategy for Inform Rare. But yeah, I think patients and caregivers are the end beneficiaries of applied health research.
Right.
And so we need to make sure that the research that we're doing is actually research that's prioritized to them and that they agree will benefit them. We
Right.
need to make sure that we're focusing on the right questions, that the outcomes that we're looking at are meaningful to patients and caregivers. And so, I think particularly in rare disease, patients and caregivers have a lot of expertise from their lived experience with rare conditions, and so it's particularly beneficial
Yeah.
to make sure that we're partnering from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, Maureen's a wonderful example of that lived experience, right?
Yeah,
And, I myself, just like you, kind of in this space, thinking about what are the important outcomes that the patient wants to achieve, right? That are not necessarily the scientific outcomes. They're the more personal outcomes associated with their activities of daily life, their fundamentals of what they believe to be a quality of life, and having those as markers for you, right? Really important, aren't they, Beth?
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Shifting gears a little bit to the adult population. Now, historically, PKU registries focusing on children, pediatric data has been the focus. But now, with so many more adults, right, living with PKU, full lives well on into adulthood, how has that shifted for you, Beth, and thinking about expansion into adult populations?
Well, I think the patient, I mean, CANPKU Plus has been, it's been a priority for them to study the adult population of PKU from beginning. I have been historically a pediatric researcher, so that's a little bit newer to me, but it's really important. I think, until about maybe the early 1990s, the sort of prevailing wisdom around treatment of PKU was that was that it may not be as important for adults to adhere to the PKU medical nutrition therapy. But we now know that actually lifelong treatment is what's recommended. And adults with PKU do experience some of the potential adverse effects of the condition if they're not well treated.
Mm.
And not a lot of adults, but some adults with PKU have kind of been lost from the system of care as a result of that earlier paradigm of only treating children. And so I think now there are a lot of important questions about adults, and we know that adolescents and young adults and into adulthood, people have a harder time sometimes with the medical nutrition therapy in terms of adherence and in terms of being in metabolic control with PKU.
Sure.
And so, and I don't think we really know exactly why. Like, I think there's a lot less evidence about adults. And in fact, some of the treatment guidelines in the US and Europe are actually make different recommendations despite having reviewed the same evidence about the treatment of adult PKU, which I think just underscores the fact that we need to improve the evidence.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And Beth, again, as someone who's focused a lot of my career on sort of the digitization of the continuum of care, talk to me a little bit about sort of the barriers that you face, whether those be sort of privacy, healthcare systemic barriers, data infrastructure barriers. Where are some of the things that you're, coming up against, whether it's adult or pediatric?
Yeah, I think, in particularly maybe in rare disease, because patients are inherently there are smaller numbers of patients. And so if we want to generate good evidence, we really have to collaborate internationally as well. But even nationally, I mean, Canada is a very big country geographically, and people are really spread out. We don't have a single healthcare system. We have different healthcare systems in each province in Canada.
Right.
So there's lots of challenges with, having to do multi-center, multi-provincial research, just in terms of kind of some of the, I don't know if it sounds dismissive to call it the administrative sides of research, but just thinking about like the multi-center research ethics, the data sharing contracts, the every center using a different electronic health system, and there's not a kind of harmonization of systems, and so that presents a lot of technological and kind of privacy barriers.
Mm.
And then I think when we think about adults, it's a bit more difficult because of some adults being lost from the kind of system of care. They've been discharged from care. Then it's harder to sort of re-engage people, both in care and research. And we worry about who we might be missing.
Mhm.
Um, and then I think adults are also, the adult care system is also not as coordinated in Canada as the pediatric care system.
Sure, sure. I think you raised a really good point there, Beth, that I think some, especially from like the American perspective, we think that, oh, there is a single, a single healthcare system in Canada, so we kind of minimize that, right? And I appreciate that you said explicitly that it's not. Yeah, maybe it's single payer, but it's not a single system. And provincially, it's different, and the healthcare information systems are different, and people are geographically dispersed through a very large country. So lots of challenges there, right, Beth? Lots of challenges. Yeah. Um, as a researcher and seeing then the application of your research into therapies and the implementation of that therapies, what are some of the exciting kind of things that you're excited about right now? A lot of times we talk about the things that are keeping us up at night, right? Those are the problem things. But what are the things that are like kind of really exciting you from a research and development perspective or treatment perspective right now? What's getting you motivated or keeping you motivated?
Well, I think it's a very exciting time in terms of therapy development for rare diseases generally and for PKU specifically. So there are new treatments that have been recently approved or that are under the sort of clinical trials into regulatory approval kind of pathways for PKU, and that really are disease modifying therapies that may really dramatically change the landscape of care. And so I think that's very exciting for patients and caregivers. And that's true of lots of rare conditions right now, I think, because of new, just the kind of very rapid pace of emerging therapies.
Sure.
And for me as a researcher, it's exciting too, because I think about how particularly registries, can contribute. For example, to serve as external control arms for clinical trials, to think about like how these different, as new therapies um, are taken up by the patient population, like how do we generate real world evidence to kind of look at how therapies compare and contrast and complement each other and so on. So I think it's an exciting time for research and also and more importantly for patients and caregivers.
Yeah, that is exciting, and it's so encouraging to hear because a lot of the conversations that we have, the rare disease research is not obviously exciting for a lot of pharmaceutical companies who are looking to kind of put out therapies that are going to have the largest impact on mass population, right? So your chronic disease conditions, if you will, right? So we know that that can be a challenge. So it is very encouraging to hear you say that there is some investment and some willingness to do that there and some improvements in the therapies. But I'm sure it still probably has a long way to go back, right?
That's right. And I think it has a long way to go in terms of what's possible too. So when there are these new therapies, like how do we evaluate them in the way that generates the best evidence we can, while also recognizing that some of the kinds of study designs and methods that are used in more common disease areas are just not going to be feasible
Right.
for some rare conditions. And so, how do we sort of figure out what's feasible and acceptable?
Makes sense, makes sense. Beth, I wanna talk for just a few minutes about sort of that the intersection of both registries, policy decisions, and then ultimately treatment accessibility, and certainly we all want the most treatment accessibility that we can possibly have and treatment equity that we can possibly have. We know policy decisions can heavily influence, availability as well as equity. And then, of course, thinking about some of the long-term guidelines that we want to publish. Can you just talk from from your perspective, I guess, Beth, how the intersection of sort of policy, access, equity, how does that all come together in your world?
That's a huge question. And I think it's different in different jurisdictions. In Canada, we have, in terms of new treatments and treatment access, we have the regulatory decision maker, so Health Canada, that will decide whether a product can be licensed. But then we have another whole kind of layer of decision making that's around the health technology assessment. So we have Canada's Drug Agency and then an S specific to the province of Quebec that actually then look at whether a treatment um, has comparative effectiveness against standard of care and whether it's cost effective. And then there's a whole kind of pricing negotiation process. And so it's actually quite a long time from a new therapy kind of being evaluated in a clinical trial until patients have access. And I think there's a lot of interest right now in thinking about like how does real world evidence potentially play into some of those pathways, especially at the kind of health technology assessment and kind of pricing side of things. Like, can we actually generate some evidence that really helps to show how people are doing and how different treatments compare to each other? that's something that's of interest to our Canada's drug agency here, and they've developed some recommendations around that.
Yeah, the emerging aspect of RWE or real world evidence is very fascinating, isn't it? And then you kind of lay in what's possible with artificial intelligence and real world evidence, and now you've really got something that potentially could be pretty game changing, right? For sure, under the right circumstances, of course, and the
Yeah.
right roles, of course, right? So, um, Beth, I'm sure you had a lot of meaningful moments in your career. And is there anything as a researcher, your perspective as a researcher that particularly stands out to you as a really meaningful moment in your work with PKU patients and families?
Yeah, I think about a year ago, we had a meeting with our kind of PKU team for Inform Rare, which includes myself. It also includes the patient CANPKU plus leaders, some of the folks you've talked to, I'm sure, and some PKU clinicians and so on. And we met to kind of take stock of some of the work that we've done, like the work that we've done so far, and to kind of make some decisions about what our priorities would be as a team moving forward. And what really struck me at that meeting was um, what a team we were, like how we have, over the years really built these collaborative relationships with one another. And we were really kind of working together, like patients and caregivers talking about what might be important to them, and clinicians weighing in, and everybody kind of listening and working together. And it really made me reflect on just how rewarding those relationships have been.
That's really rad to see. It must have felt so rewarding to see that culmination of everybody kind of sitting around a table and being like, "Yeah, we're all in this together, right? And
Yeah.
we're all working towards a greater good." That's outstanding. That for myself, I love to kind of think about a call to action, people listening to this. What's the most important thing that someone listening to this, either even if you're not within the rare disease community, but certainly if you are within the rare disease community, what can we do to support research efforts like yours and like registries?
I think the biggest thing really is working together. I think as researchers, we need to not be siloed. We need to be sharing everything that we're learning as soon as we're learning it. I
Mm.
think we need to be working together with patients and their caregivers. We need to be working across international borders, especially in rare disease. I think we just can't afford to waste time by people kind of working on their own piece and not actually being willing to kind of get out there and work together.
Yeah, I have seen in this community that sentiment echoed many times, but I've also seen in my brief experience in this community that there is a willingness, right, to share, and there is an absolute willingness because everybody realizes, look, we have to send a unified message here to policymakers, to other researchers, to the healthcare community about the important work that we're doing in rare disease research. Would you say that's accurate, Beth?
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. So for more information, informrare.ca, is that correct?
That's correct.
And
Yes.
then, of course, we always remind our folks to head over to canpku.org as well to learn more. But I was just able to spend some time on the Inform Rare website, informrare.ca. A lot of great stuff there. So very thorough, extremely educational as well. So once again, Beth Potter, thank you so much for taking time. We know you're a very busy person. Appreciate you coming on and speaking with us and helping us to continue our series on PKU and more specifically on the Pan Can PKU Plus Foundation. Couldn't get that one out. But once again, Beth Potter, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.